Professor Rory Naismith, it is a great honour to speak to you. You are Professor of Early Medieval History at Cambridge, author of many books on the Anglo-Saxon world, including recently this excellent one on King Offa, who, in my opinion, he's one of the most underrated kings in English history. Why? I think many people have heard the name, but why do we know so little about him?
Well, most people have heard the name probably through Offa's Dyke, I expect. He's associated with this big lump in the landscape, and I think that's emblematic of one of the two main issues why he's not better known. One of them is that you simply don't have the same kind of source base that you do for characters like Alfred the Great, Edward the Confessor, even Ethelred the Unready, where you've got a big juicy chronicle, you've sometimes got an actual biography of this person. You don't have that for Offa. You've got to cast quite a wide net and use quite a, let's say, challenging range of sources, right? Ranging from big lumps in the ground to coins to charters, and the chronicles are actually a relatively small part of the story. I think the second reason is because he's king of the Mercians. He's not the king of the West Saxons, and they're the ones who go on to lay the foundations of England as it develops into the later Middle Ages. They're the ones who are traditionally seen as the precursors of proper English history, whereas Mercia is a path not taken in English history. So I think there's been a sense it's a dead end, basically. On the other hand, if you go back to the 8th century, people didn't know any of that. They didn't know how things would pan out in 200-300 years' time. So you have to try and get yourself into the mindset of how Offa and his kingdom looked in the 8th century.
Let's just paint a picture of what Mercia was like in the 8th century at the beginning of Offa's reign. Are we looking, is it just the English Midlands, or had it already at that time expanded to encompass other kingdoms?
At that stage, if you could pin someone down on the street in Tamworth or wherever, and you asked them, where is Mercia? They probably would have said actually a relatively small area. It's still quite big, but we know the diocese of Lichfield, which probably has got some sort of relationship to the old core of the Kingdom of the Mercians, that's basically the Northwest Midlands. It's a big area that stretches from probably up to the Wirral down to sort of the edge of Leicestershire, further south into places like Warwickshire, places like that. It's a big area of land in the West Midlands. However, for a long time, already by the middle of the 8th century, the Kingdom of the Mercians had been a bit more than that. It had included the Middle Angles, who are basically the East Midlands, that's Leicestershire, Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, places like that. A big area of territory that's taking you down almost as far as London. And then also areas in what's now the Southwest Midlands. So the lands of the Whitshire around Worcester, the lands of the Magunseta around Hereford. They'd also been recognised as part of the Mercian kingdom for approximately 50 or 100 years by the time Offa became king. So there's a big block of territory in the Midlands I think would have been acknowledged as the kingdom of the Mercians, which I think is a little bit different from the land of the Mercians. You've got a kind of sort of Russian doll situation here. You've got the land of the Mercians, the kingdom of the Mercians, but then you've also got an area which historically had sometimes been, let's say, under Mercian overlordship, kings who'd recognized the ruler of the Mercians as top dog. That's even bigger still. We know that Offa's predecessor Athelbald, who's this very long-lived king in the first half of the 8th century, he's sometimes recognized as master of East Anglia, Kent, basically everything in southern England beyond the Humber, everything, probably including Wales as well, within that area was part of his extended area of hegemony.
They still have their own kings, right?
Very much so. Oh yeah, it's worth emphasizing straight off that this is an era where you do not have a single king of the English. You have a series of separate kingdoms. By this stage, by the time Offa becomes king, there's really only about 4 or 5 kings who are autonomous and doing their own thing. What makes it a bit complicated, you sometimes have figures who are subordinate to them but still call themselves kings. Some people might have come across this term heptarchy, the idea of there being 7 kingdoms. That's actually a simplification that somebody came up with around 1100 to make sense of all these confusing different peoples that you encounter in Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. There probably never actually were 7 kingdoms. There's just 7 that crop up quite a bit in Bede and the Chronicle.
7 larger kingdoms, I suppose, but inside those kingdoms, there's many more, right? I mean,
Yeah, basically
there's
so. Yeah,
even within, the Mercian heartlands, there's a king of the Wiche and there's a king of, the Picansete and all that stuff.
absolutely. Yeah.
So by the end of Offa's reign, I mean, what's changed?
I think the biggest change in Offa's reign is that instead of having this, like I said, kind of Russian doll situation where you've got this looser layer of supremacy that Mercian kings exercise over other kingdoms that basically carry on ruling themselves, Offa instead has actually absorbed most of those territories into his kingdom. So you've now got a single enlarged entity that Offa is trying to weld together in a more concrete way. So you see that East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, Surrey, Essex, these areas are now on their way to being absorbed into the Mercian kingdom. Their local aristocrats, their local elites come to the same royal assemblies as people from the rest of Offa's kingdom, which are very big, elaborate operations. They use Offa's coins. They're part of a single ecclesiastical network. You can see that Offa's trying quite hard to turn this into a new kind of unit, a more unified entity. He does still have that kind of supremacy over Wessex, over the Welsh. He's still thinking in those terms for some kingdoms that, for whatever reason, he's not in a position to absorb or doesn't want to absorb. But I think that the big change is that the kingdom of the Mercians proper is now a much bigger operation.
It's very interesting. So a singular currency for all of these lands. That's quite big. Even in Wessex?
Well, they use Offa's coins in Wessex. There's no indication that they're making their own coins at this stage, but you find quite a lot of coins of Offa in Hampshire, Wiltshire, Dorset, places like that. So, in effect, yes.
Fascinating. It seems to me that Offa is quite involved in continental politics and things like this. He's sending letters back and forth with Charlemagne. To what extent, I mean, is this unique for Anglo-Saxon kings? Is this one of the first times someone has done this, or is this sort of pretty normal?
It's hard to say because the reason we know so much about this for Offa is because there's a large body of letters that were originally written by this character called Alcuin, who's a Northumbrian scholar, but who is a sort of an expat. He spends a lot of his career in mainland Europe. And because he had these very diligent students who collected up his letters after he died, we've got a good picture of what he was writing and to whom. And from those, we can see quite a lot about these communications with Offa. Now, the problem is you don't have that for earlier kings. You don't have it for Athelbald, you don't have it for the 7th century. You do have occasional hints that there's communication with Frankish kings, with Rome, with other people in mainland Europe. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's completely new with Offa. What I would say is that we know a lot more about it with Offa, and I think it probably was more intense with Offa, especially in the latter part of his reign. He and Charlemagne, this really important, powerful ruler who dominates most of mainland Western Europe, he and Offa have a lot of contact with one another. They're basically frenemies. They're very conscious of what the other is doing and trying to one up each other. So I think, yes, I think there is a new development going on here, but I think that contact with mainland Europe, that had been going on. I think Offa just sees it intensify, and we are lucky enough to have a good glimpse of it.
Could you explain a bit of the sort of power play between Offa and Charlemagne in terms of trying to marry off children?
I'll do my best. Offa's Offa's kingdom it's big. It's bigger than it was. It's still a lot smaller than Charlemagne's kingdom. Offa would have been conscious of that. Charlemagne would probably have been conscious of that. At the same time, I think there's a sense that they're two distinct entities. They're two distinct spheres, and that they will kind of remain in that position. They're not one's not likely to absorb the other anytime soon. So that's why I think they're both very keen to try and maintain this sense of equality, parity, at least in terms of the rhetoric that they exchange. And that sometimes is a point of contention, because I think that there is this pretense of equality, but there's an actual, when that's actually something where they need to put their money to their mouth, they need to put their money where their mouth is, that sometimes is a problem. And so you're quite right to mention marriage. That's the key example of this. We know that at one stage, probably in 790 or so, 789, Charlemagne's son, who also is called Charles, rather unhelpfully, he makes an overture to Offa that he would like to marry one of Offa's daughters. And Offa's got several daughters. One of them would have married the king of the West Saxons quite recently at this stage. So, in principle, this may not have been seen as a bad idea. Offa might have quite liked the idea. But the problem he may have had is that traditionally in the Frankish world, princes married daughters of major subordinates. So if Offa just went along with this proposal, there might have been a concern that it was casting him in that role, and he wouldn't have liked that. So instead, what Offa comes up with is quite an elegant solution to this, which is he will go ahead with that marriage if one of Charlemagne's daughters will come and marry his son as well. And at that point, Charlemagne goes ballistic. Charlemagne doesn't like this step towards equality. He doesn't like this sense of the two kings being equal. It may also be that he's a bit reticent about sending his daughters off to marry strangers. This is something that is remarked on by Charlemagne's biographer later on, that he's a bit weird about his daughters. In any case, he's not a happy man. And he decrees that there will be no more traffic with England. All shipping across Channel will stop for the duration of this dispute. And so there's then a period of emergency diplomacy. Alcuin is involved, but doesn't really seem to get anything done. There's also a character called Gervold who does seem to smooth things over. And then when you next know about the nature of relations between these two kings, they seem to have been on much more amicable terms. So it could be patched over, but there was potential for friction.
It's a big international incident, isn't it? I mean, do you think there's any sense of, is Charlemagne looking down on Offa because he's one of these Mercian sort of frontiers people, the sort of border folk, still at this time?
Well, I think he's probably maybe looking down on a little bit, going a little bit too far. I think he's probably conscious that Offa's kingdom is smaller, but there is good evidence that Charlemagne is looking at what Offa is doing. I mean, the coins are a good illustration of this, because a couple of years after this marriage dispute, Charlemagne and Offa both completely reform their coinages, and you can see both of them taking a leaf out of the other's book. So Offa, he moves from having these wonderful coins which have got pictures of him on them, which are quite diverse in their iconography, and instead he adopts a new standardized design which is just based on the inscription saying that Offa is king of the Mercians. And that's quite similar to what Charlemagne had done with his coinage for a generation by that stage. In turn, Charlemagne, with his new coinage, clearly is looking at what Offa and his wife had done, because very unusually, you've got some coins of Offa's reign in the name of his wife, Cunithryth, and very recently there's been a coin found which is of Charlemagne and his wife, his queen, who's called Fastrada, and you can see that this is copying the coins of Cunithryth, which we know must have been made earlier. So they're both paying close attention. I think it's a game of one-upmanship. It's a game of two parties.
Some of the most interesting coins I've seen of Offa are it's the one where he's trying to pretty much emulate Rome, which is an interesting thing. I mean, is this a common thing amongst the Anglo-Saxons? Is this a new thing? Is he trying to create an empire?
Are you thinking of the ones where he's showing himself like a Roman emperor?
Like a Caesar?
Yeah, I think this was a strong tradition. There was a huge amount of interest in Rome, both in terms of Rome, the city of the emperors, the capital of this great empire that still loomed very large hundreds of years after its demise, and they would have found coins of Roman emperors in Britain. They would have read about these emperors in lots of historical texts that were available to them, and they were a favourite model for kingship, particularly figures like Constantine the Great, and some of Offa's coins are probably thinking specifically of Constantine the Great. So yes, they're conscious of that, but they're also very aware of Rome as the city of the popes, as the city of saints, which is still a really crucial feature in their mental landscape of the world. I mean, there was a very good book written a number of years ago which referred to Rome, the capital of Anglo-Saxon England, and I think that's actually quite a good way of putting it. There was a lot of consciousness of Rome as a place that people wanted to visit, they wanted to support. We know that Offa provides a sort of cash donation every year to send to Rome to keep lights burning in perpetuity. It's a very, very prominent part of thinking in Anglo-Saxon England.
Yeah, a number of kings go and retire there, don't they? And then there's sort of the Anglo-Saxon district. So Offa, I mean, he sounds like he's quite a pious man, but he's also a ruthless warlord. Would that be fair to say?
I'd say so. Yes, yes. I think that in the past people would probably have put ruthless warlord first, but I'm inclined
I
to
think they
put
go
it
hand in
second.
hand.
They do. Well, yeah, that's right. I don't think, no, I don't think they're mutually exclusive at all. What I would say is I don't think he's necessarily much more of a ruthless warlord than a lot of other Anglo-Saxons, even figures like Alfred the Great, Athelstan, Edgar. I think a lot of these guys are willing to fight, they are willing to kill, they are willing to shed blood if they think their cause is justified. And I think that with Offa, the problem is that since historically everyone has leaned on narratives like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and things derived from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, those tend to foreground the battles, the bloodshed. They don't talk about anything else, basically. So there was a sense that that was all there was to Offa. And I think that that's not correct. I think that you can see that he's not necessarily any more violent than most Anglo-Saxon kings.
It's surprising to me that there isn't a surviving history from his time. I mean, do you think that there may have been and then it was destroyed later?
I'd like to hope so.
Yeah.
I think that it's one of those questions that we're never going to know, short of developing a time machine at some stage
Mm.
in the future. Um, I I think that there's two ways you can read this. One is that there probably was more material and it's been lost. I'm overall inclined towards it. I think there's enough evidence that there is literary activity in Offa's reign, that we know he's interested in books, he's interested in written culture. So I think there probably was somewhat more material than we've got now. On the other hand, it's been suggested that maybe one reason there isn't as much material from Mercia is that they did things differently, that they just weren't producing as many texts. They weren't producing all of these literary monuments that you see, for example, in Charlemagne's kingdom, where you've got lots of letters, you've got a biography, you've got lots of chronicles being written. There's a huge amount of stuff going on. I think that it's probably a little bit of this matter of doing things differently, but I'm more inclined to think that there may have been a certain amount of material that just hasn't survived. It may have been more in the vernacular, it may have taken forms that we couldn't predict, but like I say, I think there's enough clues, enough breadcrumbs that we can reconstruct there must once have been something there.
Let's go back to the beginning. Where does Offa come from? We know basically nothing about his roots, right?
Hardly anything, no. There is a charter from Worcester which is of debatable authenticity. It survives only in an 11th century copy, so it's got a few health warnings about it. But this claims that Offa was born and raised in the lands of the Hwicce, which is in the southwest Midlands. This had been an integral part of the Mercian kingdom for a long time. This doesn't necessarily mean that he is, as it were, not a Mercian. We know that the Mercian aristocracy has been sort of implanted all over this wider kingdom in the course of the 7th and 8th centuries. We do know the names of Offa's family. We know his family background because there is a genealogy of him and his son that was produced in probably not that long after their deaths in the early part of the 9th century. And this tells us a bit about how he's plumbed into the larger Mercian dynasty, essentially he's a distant cousin of Athelbald, this king who came immediately before him. Well, not quite immediately. There's an intervening king called Beornred about whom pretty much nothing is known. But yes, he's a cousin of Athelbald, and then both of them are an even more distant cousin of the Mercian dynasty of Penda, this great pagan king who ruled in the first half of the 7th century, and whose sons and grandsons then take you through to 716. So Offa is very much part of the larger Mercian clan. There might be questions asked over this brother of Penda that they're linked to. There are an awful lot of convenient brothers of Penda who give rise to new branches of the Mercian royal family. So some of those may or may not have existed, but we don't really have anything else to go on other than gut feeling on that.
And what's the process of him being sort of chosen to be king?
Chosen, I think, is the right word because he's quite a distant relative, even of Athelbald. There were probably other people who had a similarly good claim to the throne, based at least on descent. And I think what that suggests is there must have been some other desirable quality about Offa, which meant that he was the one chosen for the big job. We don't know exactly what that was. We don't know exactly how old he was. We don't know whether he was especially brave or good in battle or clever, anything like that. It may well be he had all of those qualities. I think what we can say is that around the time when Offa himself dies in 796, then his son dies very soon after, you can see that there's a very solid cohort of aristocrats, bishops, abbots, even Offa's widow, who managed to sort of persist across this period, and they're the ones who steer Mercia into a new king's reign, a new safe direction. I suspect something similar probably happens in 757, that you've got a group of ealdormen, a group of bishops who are spanning the end of Athelbald's reign and the start of Offa's, and they're the ones who select Offa as a likely seeming young man who's got abilities, who's in good health, who's related to the previous king that they all liked, and that's how he manages to come to the throne, really, that he's got to have had some sort of support, because otherwise it's just not clear why he would have succeeded.
So this is 100 years or so, maybe a little bit more, after the days of Penda, this conquering pagan warlord. By Offa's time, is it still a militaristic society? Are we still having, men join war bands and go and raid each other? Or is it largely more peaceful?
I think it is still a relatively violent society. I think that all of England, indeed Britain, Europe at this stage is still relatively violent. We know that people could pursue feuds, they could pursue revenge against each other in legal contexts. We know that there are growing numbers of execution cemeteries where people have had their heads cut off, they've had limbs cut off, things like that. It's a society where people are quite ready to draw their swords and to have at each other. Offa builds Offa's Dyke, which has had some sort of military dimension, and we know that he is fighting some battles, as are the kingdoms around him. He's engaged in battles with Kent, with Wessex, probably the East Angles, so that one's a bit more obscure. I think the only thing I'd say is that sometimes these other kingdoms are attacking him. It's not always going one way, and that he's probably also using the carrot as well as the stick. I think people would have known that since Offa, the Mercians were the dominant power, the biggest kingdom, the biggest army, there was probably a degree of, well, seeing the writing on the wall, basically, that if people felt threatened by a neighbor, let's say, they might cozy up to the Mercians to get protection. Conversely, if they know their neighbor has cozied up to the Mercians, that in turn would lead them to want to get on board to secure some kind of stability and protection against their neighbors. So I think there were attractions to jumping onto the Mercian bandwagon. It's not necessarily a matter of Offa sending in sort of men in jackboots for every area that he's wanting to take over. There were a number of ways this could be done.
I'm going to ask you to have a wild speculate now. Do you think Offa would have actually fought in combat with his men? I mean, or is that a thing of the past?
I think it's quite likely that Offa would have, let's say, been present at the battle. Whether he'd have been at the forefront leading the charge, I'm not so sure. He certainly could have been. We know other kings did in this period, and some died in battle. But we also know some others who are willing to delegate, willing to organize things in a slightly more cautious way. I think the answer is that yes, he may have done. Probably not towards the end of his reign, since he must have been pretty elderly by the time he died. He's got to have been probably in his 20s, maybe even his 30s when he became king, and then he's ruler for nearly 40 years. So I think he's probably in at least his 60s, maybe 70s or 80s by the time he dies. And in earlier times, I could certainly imagine him leading an army. When he's in his very last years, I doubt it.
Fascinating. You briefly mentioned executions by beheading. There's a saint king. Well, he becomes a saint later. He's the king of East Anglia, and Offa has him got rid of. What is the situation there?
This is something I'm actually writing a kind of expansion piece on at the moment. It's an incredibly interesting story. It's a very difficult one to grasp the full implications of, because the first attestation we've got of this king, Ethelbert, this figure who's later a saint, really is just the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, this hostile witness to Offa, which says that in 794, Offa has Ethelbert beheaded, and that's it. They don't give you any context. They don't say why it was done. They don't say what the status of Ethelbert was.
It does that, doesn't it? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It just gives you one line, and you think, what?
Yeah.
I need more. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's incredibly frustrating, and it's the style that they cultivate. They want to make it
Yeah.
sound kind of monumental and telegraphic, even though in many cases they're actually giving you a very one-sided picture of what was going on. So yeah, with Ethelbert, we know that he's king of the East Angles. We know that he issues some coins. There's a grand total of 4 of those that survive, but those are valuable because they show that he was presenting himself as king. And so I think the most straightforward reading is that he's a member of the local dynasty, which favours names like Ethelbert. There was, in fact, another Ethelbert in the earlier part of the 8th century in East Anglia, and that Ethelbert II is trying to break away, do his own thing. The choice of having a very unusual design on some of these coins of a wolf and twins, it could be an allusion to his family background, which was the Wolfingas,
Yes.
the descendants of the wolf. It could also be that he's thinking of the twins, that it's 2 figures working side by side. In other words, he thinks, I and Offa, we're doing great. You know, this is our bid to try and work together as a team. Offa didn't see it that way. Offa has this guy executed. That's actually a very unusual act. This is one of a tiny number of known political beheadings in Anglo-Saxon history. It's not like Offa is not. He's not an 8th century Henry VIII. He's not saying off with his head, off with her head, left, right, and centre. This is, I think, the only known execution under Offa. There probably were others that we've not got information about, but this is the only one we have any specifics for. And choosing to behead him, choosing to execute him at all, probably suggests that Offa was wanting to show that he wasn't a proper king, because one of the few contexts in which Anglo-Saxon laws from a little bit after Offa's time say that execution was appropriate is when you had betrayed your lord or betrayed your king. So if Offa has Ethelbert executed, perhaps in a way that was especially associated with those who'd committed such crimes, it was a way of saying he's broken the relationship he's meant to have had with me. He's not a proper king after all. But then, since he is beheaded, and that was something that also happened to martyrs, another faction, another group of people thought, hang on a minute, this guy was a good thing, let's cultivate him as a saint. And so you can see there are probably different competing interpretations going on of what happens. Offa has him killed for one reason, and pretty soon afterwards, probably within just a few decades, maybe even sooner than that, Ethelbert is being cultivated as a saint, and they're taking that beheading in a completely different way.
Interesting, very interesting. So we've spoken briefly about the military. Just before we move on to the other big thing of his reign, which is the church, are there any other incidents like this that speak of Offa's sort of military power throughout Britain?
Well, there are allusions to him doing other things like this. There's a letter that Alcuin writes to, well, it's mentioned in a couple of letters actually from soon after Offa's death, where he says rather mysteriously that Offa's son, Edgefrith, who dies just a few months after his father, had passed away because of the sins of the father, that something Offa had done wrong was resulting in his son's punishment. Now, Alcuin, rather typically, because he's writing to other people who are contemporaries and who know what's going on, he doesn't elaborate on exactly what he's getting at. There's one of these letters where he mentions Offa having spilled a lot of blood to secure his son on the throne. Now, what he's getting at there is a bit of a mystery. It's been suggested it could be the death of Ethelbert in 794. That's possible. One slight problem there is that Edgefrith had been made king already 7 years before that. He'd been joint king with his father since 787. So it could be that Alcuin is referring to something that happened back then, around then, which we're not aware of. Um, yeah, I think he's probably doing something like that more often than we know. We also have a letter which refers to Offa and his wife doing something nefarious with a monastery. We don't know which monastery, but we know they were doing something bad to a monastery. Um, I think that there was probably more bloodshed under Offa. Like I say, I don't think he's more bloodthirsty than most other Anglo-Saxon kings. I think we've just got a fairly select record of what he got up to, and so we have to try and imagine what there was in the gaps.
Is Edgefrith a common Anglo-Saxon name, or is that actually trying to emulate the Northumbrian king of the previous century? Is it a means of unifying, Mercia with Northumbria?
That's a good question. Edgefrith is not it's not an especially unusual name, and you've got other examples of the same name being used by multiple dynasties. So there was an Ethelred of Mercia and two Ethelreds of Northumbria. There was a lot of this kind of thing. What is unusual is that Offa's own name is what's called a monothematic name. Most Anglo-Saxon names are dithematic, so it's Alfred,
Mm.
Ethelred, Edgar, Edgefrith. Offa isn't like that. Offa is it's what's often called a hyperchoristic name. It's a fancy way of saying a nickname. It's like
Oh.
having it's like if you had say a King William and he insists on being called Bill. And on
Mm.
his coins, on his charters, and everything, he always wants to be called Bill. That's the kind of situation we're in with Offa, and it's quite unusual. And it might mean that he was actually always known as Offa. There's no source that ever says he had a different name.
Mm.
But the fact that he calls his son Edgefrith, it may be taking a leaf out of Offa's father's name, which was Thingfrith, which is a
Ah.
quite unusual name. And it's even been suggested that Offa might have been called something like Osfrith or something along those lines, and then Offa is a shortened form of that. Like I said, there's no clear evidence that that was actually the case in Offa's reign, or from Offa's reign, but it would just make sense of this otherwise quite quirky pattern in the names, because Anglo-Saxon dynasties, they generally quite like having a pattern of names that go through a family. That often will mean using the same initial letter or the same initial element. For Offa to break from that is unusual.
And isn't it an old name from the continent as well, from an old heroic king from myth?
It is. There was a previous Offa known as Offa of Angeln, which is where the Angles get their name from. This is the bottom part of Jutland, which has been part of Germany for a long time now, but historically was part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And yes, this figure actually comes up in some Anglo-Saxon royal genealogies. They like to say that they were descended from Offa, the ancient Offa, who, if he genuinely existed, would have been around in the 4th or 5th century. There are legends about him. He's referred to in a couple of Anglo-Saxon heroic poems. There is even this gloriously fantastical, gloriously made up 13th century text called The Lives of the Two Offas, which is written by a character called Matthew Paris, monk at
Yeah.
St. Albans. Yeah, and this is why it's not strictly true that there is no biography of Offa. There is this much later biography of Offa. It's just full of battles and magic and miracles and all the kind of stuff that you see in texts of that era, like Geoffrey Robb.
Mm.
It's not Arthurian, but it's in that same kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
rollicking
Yeah.
vein. And yeah, it's not really telling us anything we didn't know about the 8th century. There's one or two details in it that suggest Matthew may have had access to other sources that are lost to us. But unfortunately, unpicking all of that and knowing where he got them from is just not doable.
Fascinating. Right. What's Offa's relationship with the church? Is there a certain amount of reorganizing that goes on?
There's two major things I think one can say about Offa and the church. One is that he's quite keen to try and reformulate the way he and the monasteries, the so-called minsters of this period, and also the bishops work together. He likes the idea of this being quite a unified operation, and you can see that he and his bishops hang out together. He likes to combine royal assemblies of aristocrats with what are called synods. So these are provincial meetings of bishops where everyone from Canterbury or later Lichfield would come together and discuss issues of common concern. This was something that Alcuin had misgivings about. There's a letter that he wrote to the Bishop of Leicester, which is one of the most powerful episcopal sees in Offa's kingdom, and he complains about how the bishops are a little bit too cozy with Offa. They're a bit too comfortable, as he puts it, listening to stories about Ingeld, this hero of yesteryear.
Oh,
Um,
that's interesting.
yeah,
That's interesting. So
yeah.
this is the court where there may have been sort of bardic poems going on.
That's right. Alcuin is, I mean, he's probably not so much against the poems in and of themselves. What he's against is mixing those spheres together a bit too often and a bit too
Mm.
comfortably. He thinks that
Yeah.
basically Offa is a little bit too, well, Offa's bishops are a little bit too cozy and friendly with the king. Now, that actually would have had plenty of advantages if you were Offa, if you were in Offa's kingdom. That's
Mm.
good team building is what you'd call it nowadays, if it were a big corporation or something like that. But Offa is doing the same thing with a lot of the monasteries. England has got loads and loads of monasteries, minsters at this time. There aren't really any parish churches as we'd understand them. So the monasteries are crucial not just as places where people pray for your soul, but places that actually minister to the surrounding population of both aristocrats and commoners. And what you can see Offa doing is building a kind of federation of these, which are under his and his wife's direct control. And we know about this from a really, really unusual survival, which is a document from Rome, from this text called the Liber Diurnus, which is a sort of collection of formulas that popes would use to write letters, to write privileges for people. And at one stage in one of these documents, which is supposed to be completely ironed out, they're supposed to get rid of any details that tell you who the original was from, and it's meant to be just a model you can use. They forget to remove the name of Offa's wife, which is very distinctive. And so you can tell that this was originally a privilege for Offa and his wife. And it talks all about how the Pope is granting them perpetual mastery over a selection of monasteries that were all dedicated to St. Peter. Unfortunately, all it says is there is a list of these monasteries appended, then that list is gone. So we don't know which all of these were, but there was a large number of monasteries dedicated to St. Peter. Some of these might have had that dedication already, some of them might have had it changed so Offa could take over, and these span the whole of Offa's kingdom. So they're building this really quite large network of monasteries that they're operating for themselves. And this goes hand in hand with what's going on with the bishops. Now that's one half of what's going on. The other half of what's going on is the Archbishopric of Lichfield. England has got two archbishoprics now. It's had two archbishoprics since the 8th, 9th centuries, and that seems in the Anglican world just like the way things are. It's not always been the way things were, because there was this brief period of 16 years between 787 and 803 when there was a third archbishopric based at Lichfield. And this is created under Offa's supervision in the aftermath of a visit by two papal legates to England, where surely this was one of the items that was floated on the agenda, and then Offa pushes it through over the next few years.
So he's working with the Pope on this?
He is, yes.
Yeah.
There's the challenging thing about Lichfield is since it's not there for very long, it doesn't generate much of a paper trail, even by Anglo-Saxon standards. And most of what we do know about it comes, again, from hostile sources. There's a mention of it in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is written very much from a pro-Canterbury point of view. They describe this not as a new archbishopric is made for the Mercians. This is Canterbury loses part of its province. You know, that tells you what direction they're coming from. And then the other source we've got is a whole bunch of letters from the beginning of the 9th century that are all about how they're going to disestablish the Archbishopric of Lichfield. So from these, you get a few hints of what the arguments were for creating it in the first place. They refer to Offa having gone to Pope Hadrian I, in the 780s, and claimed that everyone in England was behind this, which they may well have been because they didn't want to go against Offa.
Yeah.
And it also says that Offa claimed that this was a proper recognition of the scale and powerful state of his own kingdom. Which is perfectly valid. And it's worth saying that the Archbishopric of York was pretty new at this stage. It had only been created in the 730s, so 50 odd years earlier. And yeah, so it's not necessarily as crazy as it seems creating a new archbishopric. And then also the Archbishopric of Canterbury is quite big by early medieval standards. It's got a lot of bishops under it, and so dividing it, again, wouldn't have seemed so very unreasonable if you were thinking about it from the Pope's point of view, where you're used to archbishoprics that have got sometimes just 5 or 6 bishops under them. Canterbury, which has got about a dozen, seems pretty large.
History really would have been very different had Edgefrith survived, I think. Well, it could have been anyway. You know, obviously the Vikings come in and sort of wreck everything as well. At this point, I'm thinking Offa's entourage, right? I mean, is it made up of people from all the different kingdoms that are under him?
Yes, I think it is. I think Offa's kingdom is well, he's got some people from all these kingdoms who are coming to him. They want to get their charters endorsed. They want to get grants of land. So by default, he's got a lot of visitors coming through. I think that the sort of core of his main advisors, his main friend group, if you could call it that, that seems to have been a bit more Mercian focused. But
Okay.
we can see that some of these figures are acquiring land and acquiring interest in Sussex, in London, in Essex, in Kent. So, although they might be from Mercia originally, you can see they're building up connections in the whole of this Mercian kingdom because, of course, as far as they know, that's how things are going to stay. But yes, I think you're quite right. Edgefrith is an unknown quantity in lots of this because he dies so quickly. There are a few hints from the period, the brief period when he's king, that he was seeking to do things differently to his father. He seems to want a closer relationship with Wessex. He may have been more favourable towards the Archbishop of Canterbury than Lichfield. There's a few hints that he might have done things differently. There's no indication that he married or had children, which is unusual, especially because by this stage he's got to have been in his 20s at least by the time he dies. So that's a strapping young gentleman by Anglo-Saxon standards.
Holding out for a very good marriage, though, I assume. Holding out maybe for
it's possible.
a continental bride or something.
Yeah. He may have hoped that something could have come back on the agenda with Charlemagne. We don't know. We just have no indication of a wife. Yeah, he just is on the throne for only a very brief time. But yes, as you say, there is a parallel universe out there somewhere in which Edgefrith lives to a ripe old age, and maybe we'd all be living in Mercia rather than England now, if that had been the case. That the extended Mercian kingdom might have been cemented, might have persisted through the 9th century. The West Saxons might not have been the ones to lead the fight against the Vikings. You can imagine all sorts of alternative scenarios.
We've got to talk about the Dyke, obviously, but just before we get there, what is going on in Wessex at this time? Obviously, Wessex becomes the foremost kingdom in the 9th century, and then it forms what we know as England now. What's going on at this time?
Wessex is the main kingdom south of the Humber that is never absorbed by Offa. I think Offa is still clearly the dominant force in southern England. I think even the West Saxons would have acknowledged that this was a bigger, more powerful kingdom that they had
Would they
to
have
face off
called
against.
him their king?
I don't think so. I think on the whole they would have seen it as two kingdoms. One is just more powerful than the other. And you can see this in a number of ways. You can see that sometimes the kings of the West Saxons they even appear in charters with Offa once or twice. You can see that one of them, Beorhtric, who comes to the throne in 786, he marries one of Offa's daughters, and he seems to have been on much more favourable terms with Offa. So I think at that stage you can see Wessex really is within the Mercian orbit. It just is still a separate kingdom. It's dealing with the Mercians in that way, but it's doing so as a separate kingdom. They have a string of kings in the same way as Mercia does. There is a famous annal in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's for the year 757, but it's referring to events actually about 30 years later. Most of them, as we said earlier, most of the annals at this period are very short. They're one-liners. They're very clipped. The annal for 757 goes on and on and on. It's really lengthy, and this gives you this detailed account of how King Cunewulf, who rules until 786, is caught quite literally with his trousers down while he's with his lady friend in the woods by Cuneherd, who is the kinsman of someone that he banished and did wrong to much earlier. And so there's a battle between these two forces, between Cunewulf and these guys who catch him in the woods. And then after Cunewulf has been killed, then another force of his men turns up who've heard that there is this fight going on. And there's a second battle between them and the men of Cuneherd where they exchange all these sort of cries to each other about, we won't fight for anyone except our lord and we'll never follow his killer. It's all very dramatic. And the theory is that this probably stems from some sort of maybe poetic text that deals with this clash and then has been turned into prose form by the Chronicle. So I think that tells us that Wessex has got its own problems. Wessex has also got violence. Wessex has probably got a history of separate kingdoms being bound together. It's been suggested that maybe the counties of Wessex, like Hampshire, Wiltshire and so forth, may once have been separate kingdoms that have been brought together. And there's still a bit of that going on in the 8th century.
Fascinating. Offa's Dyke. What's it for, Rory? What's it for?
Well, I wish I could jump in my time machine and go back and give you a hard answer. I think that it remains. It is obviously Offa's Dyke. It's a huge monument. It's the biggest single thing built in Anglo-Saxon England that we still have with us now. It's about 170 miles long. At its height, when it was first built, it probably would have been about 4 meters high. The bank would have been about 4 meters high, and then the ditch would have been another, I think, 2 or 3 meters deep. So it's a big, big thing. I mean, I think that it survives in a fairly weathered form, but if anyone lives nearish where I am in Cambridge, you can go out to this thing called the Devil's Dyke, which is a little bit earlier, but it's on a similar scale and it's rather better preserved, and it's really quite a formidable barrier. And so if you imagine something like that, but running for pretty much the whole length of the Anglo-Welsh border, it's just a huge investment of time, energy. It's a huge statement of power and control. It's the comparison that's been made in some of the scholarship is it's a bit like building the entire M6 by hand. It's seriously impressive. As for why it's built, there's two main possibilities, and I don't think these are mutually exclusive. I think that sometimes it's been a bit of a red herring trying to look for it must be one or it must be the other. One theory is it's basically got a military, a defensive role, that it's there to try and at least impede, at least be an obstacle to any armies that want to come from the west to the east. And that would have been true. It certainly would have been a big problem. It wouldn't have been a complete barrier, but it would have significantly slowed down a force that wanted to get from west to east. And if you imagine that there were also patrols of Mercian men going up and down this, there may have been sort of supporting defenses, there may have been supporting forts, a little bit like on Hadrian's Wall, but not quite as frequent as that. Then Offa's Dyke would have been actually a pretty effective barrier. It could even be that there was meant to be more of that kind of thing, more in the way of support, but it was never built. They maybe didn't get to it before the end of Offa's reign. We don't know. The second proposition that's been put forward for why it was made is that it's more of a symbolic gesture. Now, you might imagine, why on earth would you build something this big if it's symbolic? Well, I think symbolic is the wrong word here. I think it's trying to send a message. It's trying to make a statement. Might be a better way of putting it. It's designed to look impressive. It's designed to show that you're dealing with a force that controls that whole area and can afford to bring in the men to build something on this scale, which hopefully would have been off-putting to any Welsh king who thought they were going to put together an army and attack. I think that there were probably other dimensions to it as well. So, for example, when the Dyke is first referred to by Asa, who is Alfred the Great's biographer, writing about 100 years after Offa's reign, he casually mentions this big dike, which was built by Offa, and he says it was a great vallum, a great ditch, a great bank that ran from sea to sea, is the phrasing that he uses in the Latin. Now, that terminology, building a great big barrier from sea to sea, that's not new. This is something that Bede and before him Gildas had used in the 8th and the 6th centuries, respectively, to talk about the barriers built by the Romans in the north, Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. Now, those texts and those barriers would have been well known to Asa, but also to Offa, also to the Britons. And I think that those northern ones were built to hold back the barbarians from getting into Roman Britain, basically the land of the Britons. So for Offa to build a great big dike like this that runs from sea to sea, but now blocking in the Britons, blocking in the Welsh to the west, I think that's actually sending a new kind of statement. It's making a claim about legitimacy. It's saying that we are now the proper inhabitants of Britain, and you, the Welsh, are the barbarians. You've been recast, basically.
So he's clearly decided, I'm not going to conquer Wales, I'm going to leave Wales alone. I mean, is there a particular reason for this?
Yeah, it does seem that he looks at Wales differently. It's a little, you could argue it's a little bit like Wessex or indeed Northumbria, these other English kingdoms that he decides are just not, I would say not worth taking over, but perhaps they're too big nuts to crack, and he's happy to sort of keep them under his dominion, but not absorb them in the same way as he had done with other kingdoms. Yeah, I think the Welsh kingdoms are, they're in the mountains. They're very uh, putting up very stiff resistance. There's a long
Yeah,
history of fighting them.
hard to
Um,
conquer. It's quite clever, really, that he sort of leaves them.
yeah, precisely. Yeah, I think building Offa's Dyke is a way of saying to the Welsh that this is the boundary of my territory. You will not come in here, and I will only go over there if I want to put you in your place. And building this dike is a it's a signal that he intends to do so. It's a signal that the Welsh place is beyond that dike and in their own kingdoms doing their own thing. And you can see that there are a couple of military expeditions that Offa takes into Wales in the latter part of his reign, presumably going beyond Offa's dike. We don't know if it's for any specific reason. It might have just been for, for a jolly. They want to go and rough up the Welsh, take some of their stuff, kill some of their people. Or there might have been specific reasons. There could have been some kind of threat to Offa. There could have been some kind of threat to Offa's allies. We don't know. But we do know that he treats the Welsh quite differently. He doesn't seem to have wanted to take them over. He sees them as a separate territory which he wants to dominate. He wants to have hegemony over, but he doesn't want to bring it into his kingdom in the same way as he'd done with some other Anglo-Saxon territories.
Fascinating. I've realised we haven't even mentioned Northumbria, really. What's going on in Northumbria there at this time? I mean, would they have called off a king?
No. In fact, there's not all that much evidence to tell us about what Offa has to do with Northumbria. There's no evidence that they're fighting one another. There's some evidence that they're trading with one another. You find Northumbrian coins in the south, and you find some coins of Offa in Northumbria. The main thing that we know is that towards the end of Offa's reign in 792, there's a marriage between one of his daughters and King Ethelred of Northumbria. Now, this presumably is a little bit like the marriage with Wessex. It's a way of building a peaceful relationship with these kingdoms, but also if you're the king sending your kid off to marry these other figures, it's it's a subtle way of saying who's the dominant party in this scenario. You're not absorbing this kingdom, you're not taking it over, but you are demonstrating that you're the kind of godfather, as it were. You're the one in the driving seat. So I think this marriage is doing that. It probably doesn't achieve what Offa hoped it would achieve, because Ethelred of Northumbria, Ethelred the First Northumbria, gets killed just a few years later in bloody fashion, which is what happens to most kings of the Northumbrians in this period. They've got a fairly rapid turnover of rulers from the 750s onwards, really. There's a long period where most of these guys don't last longer than 5 years, 10 years. Some of them a lot less than that. Ethelred is one of a couple who is king for a while, then gets sent into exile, then comes back again. So there's a complicated situation going on in Northumbria. You've probably got at least two major aristocratic factions vying with each other for control of the kingdom. But unfortunately, we really only have quite brief, terse annals from much later times telling us about this. So it's a story that can only be half unpicked, I think.
It's so tantalising, isn't it? We just have brief fragments. It's very impressive that you've written this excellent book, which everybody should have a look at, because it's quite a thick book, and there's not all that much evidence, really. Are there any other big bits of evidence that we've missed that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think we've mentioned all the major highlights. I think it's worth stressing that since the narrative sources are such a problem, you have to fall back quite heavily on two other major things, which are the charters. And we've mentioned these occasionally, but it's just worth saying that these are documents that record that I, King so and so, give this piece of land to someone or other. And you've normally got a date in here. You've also often got a witness list of who was there when the grant was made. Sometimes these charters survive in their original form, which is really valuable, and you can sometimes see that they've been endorsed by Offa. They've been taken to Offa's court, and he and his scribes have had this extra message added on the back. But most of them only survive in a much later copy from the 12th century or after. So you've sometimes got to do a bit of fancy footwork with comparing these to other documents to see how much of it is reliable. The other major thing that we've mentioned a little bit so far is the coins, and these are a very different kind of source. There are more of them. They're obviously only little bits of metal, so they can only have so much text on them, but they still give you a number of different titles for Offa. They show that he's very keen on being referred to always as King of the Mercians. You might think that with this bigger kingdom, this dominant status that he achieves, there would be more or longer titles assigned to him, but on the whole, no, he seems to want to be King of the Mercians. There are some charters and some coins that call him King of the Angles. This has sometimes been read as King of the English, and people have thought that he's establishing a proto-kingdom of the English, but it's much more likely that the very few sources which do call him this are just trying out a new way of thinking about his kingdom, which in fact chimes with what the Archbishop of Lichfield is doing, because we have a 12th century text which tells us that the bishops assigned to Lichfield were all of the ones based north of the Thames, except for the Bishop of London, who is, of course, the Bishop of the East Saxons. So, in effect, what you've got is what you've got in Lichfield is an Archbishop of the Angles, except for the ones who live in Northumbria. So that may have been the way Offa is choosing to think at some points in his reign. And that's where the coins of the charters come together so well.
How interesting. What happens to the Archbishopric of Lichfield then?
Well, it looks like Cernwulf, who's the king that comes along after Edgefrith, has just got different priorities. He's not as invested in the Archbishop of Lichfield. He's on better terms with this new Archbishop of Canterbury, who's been appointed from Lincolnshire, from within the Mercian kingdom, who seems to have been much more amenable to the Mercians. And so Cernwulf is quite happy for this new Archbishop of Canterbury to make a case to the Pope that Lichfield should never have been an archbishopric in the first place, and it is disestablished. At one point, Cernwulf suggests that a third option might have been to establish, or rather to move the Archbishopric of Canterbury to London, which was described as the original scheme by Gregory the Great in the years around 600 when the English mission is beginning. But the Pope doesn't go for that, and Cernwulf is quite happy for Lichfield to be demoted back to a bishopric and for Canterbury to remain the sole archbishopric.
Fascinating. Right, last couple of questions. I've got a big picture question now. It may be difficult to answer, but how big is the world of Offa at this point? How far-reaching are his diplomatic contacts? We've got Charlemagne, obviously, but does it go further than that? Is he in contact, or is somebody in contact with, even further to the east, even further to the south? We know, there's the dirham of Offa, the very famous dirham. Are there any actual links to the Islamic world, or is this just a knock-on effect?
I think that there must have been people from Offa's kingdom who went to the Muslim world. There's no direct evidence that Offa... Well, there's a wonderful text known as the Hoduaporicon. That's a word to say 10 times quickly. The Hoduaporicon of this character, Saint Willibald, who's originally from Wessex, and he dictates this well, it's basically an autobiography. It's presented as a hagiography, but a lot of it is coming from this guy's own words, who's doing this in his 80s. When he was a young man in the first half of the 8th century, he goes on a very long pilgrimage, starting out in Rome, going on to southern Italy, but then he also goes on to the Byzantine Empire, to Anatolia, what's now Turkey, and then eventually to Jerusalem as well. So we know there were people making this journey. There's even a couple of manuscripts from a monastery on Mount Sinai in Egypt, which have got insular script in them, the kind of writing that was being produced in England and in parts of Germany under English ecclesiastical influence. So there's lots of evidence that there were, well, I wouldn't say lots of, there is some evidence that there were contacts, but I don't think that necessarily translates to regular, significant diplomatic missions. And you mentioned the Offa dinar. This is a wonderful thing. It's completely unique. Gold coin, which is imitating a gold piece of the caliphs. It reproduces the Arabic script they have on this, but in the middle of it, they insert the words Offa Rex, King Offa. Now, as the one thing that immediately strikes anyone who's an Islamic specialist that looks at this is that the Offa Rex bit is upside down relative to the Arabic. And I think that's really quite telling, because they didn't have a clue what this stuff said in England. It's just lines and squiggles as far as they're concerned, which they have to try and replicate as closely as they can. And this thing was probably not made primarily for dealing with the Muslim world itself. I think if you turned up in Baghdad and tried to spend this thing, you would have been in serious trouble. It would not have passed muster.
Yeah.
I think it's much more likely that this coin is made for dealing with the Pope. It's made for dealing with Rome, which is quite funny when you think that it's a coin that has Arabic inscriptions saying there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. There's plentiful evidence that these sorts of coins were being widely used in Italy, in central and northern Italy in the later 8th century. And so that's probably the context Offa is trying to insert his coins into. This is the way you make prestige payments in Italy in the 780s and 790s. You imitate these Arabic gold pieces, and that's just the way these things were done. There are other gold coins of Offa that do things differently, because these are just ad hoc special issues for particular payments. There's a wonderful one which is imitating a gold coin of Augustus, the Roman Emperor Augustus. It's in the name of a moneyer called Pendred. And when this coin was rediscovered in the early modern period, it was in the collection of this chap called Robert Cotton, who was a major assembler of manuscripts and coins, all sorts of stuff in the late 16th, early 17th century. He thought this coin was a coin of Uther Pendragon.
Oh,
Um,
right.
yeah, so
Excellent.
he made a case for this, and then it was only recognised as a coin of Offa's money much later.
Fascinating. If somebody was coming to England from afar, or even just in England, looking to see Offa's reign on the landscape, or in museums, in church architecture, where should they go? Most of the churches we have that are left are Norman or later. Is
Yeah.
there anywhere that we can see this reign, this 8th century reign, still?
Well, I think there's 3 places I'd recommend if you want to go and get. Actually, no, 4 places I'd recommend if you want to go and get a sense of Offa's reign, Offa's England. One is Offa's Dyke. You really need to go to Offa's Dyke if you want to get a sense of what his kingdom was capable of, what kind of thing they could build. One other place is
Just before you,
Yeah.
what are the best bits of Offa's Dyke to see?
Well, I think you could do a lot worse than going to the Offa's Dyke Centre, the Offa's Dyke Visitor Centre, which is in Knighton. This is in the central part of Offa's Dyke, and they've got a whole museum you can look at with lots of information about the Dyke. And then also it's in an area where you've got a relatively well-preserved section of Dyke, so you can go and walk it and then go to the museum. If you feel bold and fit, you can walk the whole thing. It'll take you a few days because, like I said, it's about 170 miles, but you can walk as much or as little of it as you want to. And there's ongoing research that's trying to pin down just how extensive Offa's Dyke was, because in some places it's been ploughed out, in some places it's very hard to detect, but it's now thought that it really did run pretty much that whole distance. So there's Offa's Dyke. The next thing I'd recommend is Brixworth. This is a church in Northamptonshire. It's a really remarkable thing. It's a big church. It is almost all from the late 8th or early 9th century. It's got a tower that was added in the 10th century, and then an extra bit was added on top of that tower in I think the 13th or 14th century. But yeah, it's the biggest, best preserved Anglo-Saxon church anywhere in England, basically.
Fantastic.
And it's a wonderful thing. So I'd heartily recommend anyone goes and see that. And they actually have a lecture there every year in October, all about some aspect of Anglo-Saxon history, because it's such a key monument in from that period. The other 2 things I recommend: Peterborough, which was a major monastery of Offa's time, and which has still got some sculpture of this period. You could, if you're thinking about sculpture, you could also perhaps visit Bredon on the Hill, which is another church on a prominent outcrop of rock in the Midlands. This is on the edge of Leicestershire, and it's absolutely full of sculpture from the time of Offa. These show you all sorts of figures from the Bible, creatures, vegetation, all kinds of stuff like that. There's also the Lichfield angel, this wonderful painted angel, carved angel that was found when they were doing some building in the cathedral there a few years ago. So there's a few places with sculpture. That would be my next category. And then finally, I'd say you could go to London, to particularly the British Museum, Museum of London, places where they've got a lot of material culture from this period. You can see the coins, you can see other objects from the period. You can just get a feel for the movable, portable artifacts that survive from this era.
Absolutely fantastic. That was a blast. Thank you, Rory. Thanks for your time.
That's all right. My pleasure.
Everybody check out his book. Anything else you want to say?
No, just thank you very much indeed for having me, and it's always a pleasure to talk Offa, to talk about Anglo-Saxons.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.